Good evening, and welcome back to SleepWise. Tonight, we are going to sit together for a long, unhurried while with one of the strangest and gentlest facts of modern life. That a whole person, with all their thoughts and worries and memories, with their quiet plans for the following morning, and the small ache in one shoulder, and the half-remembered melody of some song they heard in a shop last week, can be asked to lie down on a table, can be asked to count backward from 10, and somewhere around 7 will simply, quietly cease, not die, not sleep, something else that we do not have a good word for. And then, some hours later, an hour or 3 hours or 6, will be handed back to themselves, blinking beneath a bright ceiling light, unhurried, wrapped in a warm blanket, whole again. This is the small ordinary miracle that we call anesthesia. And it is, when you look at it very closely and stay with the looking, one of the deepest mysteries the human species has ever domesticated. Domesticated is exactly the right word, I think. We have not solved it. We have not fully explained it. We have simply, over the course of about 180 years, learned to hold it in our hands, the way a bright and mysterious animal is held in the hands of a person who has learned it will not bite. So tonight, let it be slow. Let the room be as dim as it is. Let your shoulders sink into whatever they are resting against, and if there is a pillow beneath your cheek, let your cheek settle into it a little more heavily. And let me tell you, in a very unhurried way, the story of how we learned to switch consciousness off, and how, sometime later, we learned to switch it back on, and how even now we do not entirely know what it is that we are switching. This is a story with 3 or 4 characters and a great many years, and we will take them in their proper order, and none of them are urgent, and none of them require anything from you at all. There will be a young dentist in Boston with a glass inhaler. There will be a country doctor in Georgia who saw something at a party. There will be a Scottish obstetrician who fell asleep beneath his own dining table. There will be a queen. There will be, at the very center of it all, the small, deep, walnut-shaped structure inside your own head, which is quietly humming right now, and which is the switchboard on which the whole of your experience arrives. Consciousness, what a strange word, really, for the thing we are made of. The philosophers have wrestled with it for centuries, and the neuroscientists have wrestled with it for decades. And no one yet has given an answer that satisfies everyone else in the room. It is what it feels like to be you. It is the redness of red, not the wavelength, not the reflectance, but the redness, the way the color arrives inside your head with something we can only call vividness. It is the softness of the pillowcase beneath your cheek, in the specific way that softness feels to you tonight, and not the way it feels to your neighbor, and not the way it feels to a cat, but the way it feels to you. It is the low humming attention with which you are, right now, following this sentence. It is quiet, and it is constant, and it is very difficult to describe in a way that a stranger could recognize from the description alone. The philosopher David Chalmers, some 30 years ago now, gave this problem a name that has stuck. He called it the hard problem. He said quite reasonably that we can, in time, explain how the brain does its various clever computations, how it recognizes a face, how it remembers a phone number, how it decides which arm to lift. Those, he said, were the easy problems. Easy not because they were simple, but because we could, at least in principle, imagine a full mechanical explanation for them. The hard problem, he said, was something else entirely. Why is there anything it is like to be a brain doing those things at all? Why does the computation come with a feel? Why is there an inside? To that question, no one, not the neuroscientists, not the philosophers, not the priests, not the poets, has yet given an answer that closes the case. And yet, here is the true astonishment, the reason we are gathered here tonight. A small, clear liquid, dripped patiently into a vein at the crook of the elbow, can turn the whole thing off. Not paused, in the way a dreamer is paused, not slowed, in the way a tired mind is slowed, off. And then, some hours later, it comes back on and you are you again. And you were never, for that quiet interval, anywhere at all. That is the trick we are trying to understand tonight. Not the how of the drugs, not yet, but the sheer mild strangeness of a self that can be dimmed and then relit, and be none the worse, and none the wiser, for the darkness in between. Hold that in your mind gently as we go, that you are a phenomenon which can be quite tenderly switched off, and that this is not, as it happens, a metaphor. This is a very old wish, of course, the wish to be spared. Long before we understood what we were doing, long before we had chemistry or biology or even the word for either of them, we wanted, when the knife came, to be somewhere else. In the tombs of ancient Sumer and in the papyri of Egypt, we find poppy, the drowsy poppy, from whose scored milky sap comes opium, mentioned as a comfort for the dying and a mercy for the wounded. The Ebers Papyrus, written in Egypt around the 15th century before the Common Era, contains a recipe for a paste of poppy to quiet a crying child. In India, the great compendium of surgical knowledge called the Sushruta Samhita, some 2,500 years old, describes the use of wine and cannabis and certain fumes to dull the pain of the surgeon's operations. In China, in the 2nd century of the Common Era, the physician Hua Tuo is said to have compounded a mixture called Ma Fei San, literally cannabis boiled powder, which he gave to patients before opening the abdomen. His recipe, sadly, does not survive. The story does. And in the medicine gardens of medieval Europe, monks and apothecaries steeped a sponge in the juice of mandrake, hemlock, and henbane, 3 plants that grow still in the shady corners of old walled gardens, dried the sponge slowly in the shade, then wetted it again beneath the nose of a patient about to be cut. This was called Spongia somnifera, the sleeping sponge, and it appears in the herbal manuscripts of Salerno and Bologna as if it were quite ordinary. Sometimes it worked, often it did not, and often it worked too well, and the sleeper did not return, because the plants in the sponge were also, as we would now say, dangerously narrow of therapeutic window. Alcohol was tried too, vast, deliberate, staggering quantities of wine, and later of gin and rum, and it did dull the pain, but it did not truly quiet the mind, and it did not spare the patient the memory of what had been done. For most of human history, then, surgery was the thing you endured awake, and biting a leather strap, awake and held down by strong friends and steadfast strangers, awake and listening to the surgeon's voice giving instructions to his assistants, and hearing, above the noise of your own breathing, the small, hard sounds of instruments being reached for on a tray. It is worth remembering once in a while how new comfort really is, how very recently, in the great slow river of human days, mercy of this particular kind was rare. When the first railways were being laid across England, when the piano was being invented, when Shakespeare had been dead already for 200 years, the person on the surgical table was still awake. So we should be tender when we think about this. We are the first people in a long line who did not have to be brave in that particular way. The change came, as important changes so often do, from a small and quite unglamorous room. On the morning of Friday, October 16, 1846, in a granite building in Boston, on Fruit Street, at what we now call Massachusetts General Hospital, a young dentist named William Thomas Green Morton stood beside an operating table with a glass inhaler cradled in his hands. He was not, by all accounts, a particularly confident man. He had spent the previous months experimenting on his own patients in his dental office, and on a spaniel, and on himself, trying to work out the correct concentration of a certain sweet-smelling vapor that had been kicking around chemistry laboratories for centuries. The vapor was ether, properly diethyl ether, and its inebriating effects had been known since the 16th century, when Paracelsus noted that it caused chickens to fall down and get up again unharmed. Inside Morton's inhaler was a saturated sponge. On the sponge, the ether. The surgeon that morning was John Collins Warren, then 68 years old, gray at the temples, and the founding editor of what is now the New England Journal of Medicine. He had asked Morton, with the polite skepticism of his time, whether the young dentist really believed his gas could quiet the patient. He had also arranged, out of a certain kindness, that the amphitheater would be full of physicians and medical students who would either witness a triumph or would witness the young dentist's public humiliation, but who would in either case witness something worth remembering. The patient's name was Edward Gilbert Abbott. He was a printer, 20 years old, and he had a tumor beneath the angle of his jaw that had been troubling him for some time. He sat in the operating chair, in his ordinary clothes. He was handed the inhaler. He was told to breathe. He breathed. His breathing slowed. His face went smooth as a lake in the evening, which is the phrase the observers, more than one of them, later used. Warren stepped forward. Warren cut. And Abbott. Abbott did not cry out. He moved slightly, He made a small sound that some later described as a moan. But he did not fight, and he did not scream. And when Warren stitched the wound closed and washed his hands and turned to the small crowd of physicians on the tiered wooden benches above, he said quite plainly, in his careful Boston voice, "Gentlemen, this is no humbug." That amphitheater is still there. It is on the 4th floor of the Bullfinch building. They call it the Ether Dome, and you can walk into it, today if you like, the way one walks into any old and important room, and stand in the quiet. Within a fortnight, the news of what had happened there had crossed the Atlantic. Within 3 months, the operation had been repeated in London, in Paris, in Vienna. Within a year, ether was being used in field hospitals during the war with Mexico. Within a decade, no serious surgeon in the Western world would operate without it. The world had changed in a granite building on a Friday morning in October, and most of the people alive on that day never knew. The credit for what happened in the Ether Dome belonged in honesty to more than one man. In a small town in Georgia called Jefferson, 4 years earlier, on March 30th, 1842, if we want the exact date, a country physician named Crawford Williamson Long had already used ether to remove a cyst from the neck of a young man named James M. Venable. Long was 27 at the time, a graduate of the University of Pennsylvania's medical school, and he had come home to practice among the people he had grown up with. He had noticed, at the raucous ether frolics of the medical students of his day, parties in which the vapor was passed around and inhaled for the sheer pleasure of feeling foolish, that people staggering around with fresh bruises did not seem to feel them at all. It was only later, when the ether wore off, that they discovered the bruises and were surprised by them. Long put two thoughts together in a quiet way and asked Venable, who had been putting off the removal of his cyst out of a very reasonable fear of the pain, whether he would like to try. Venable agreed. Long saturated a towel with ether, held it over Venable's face, and cut the cyst free. Venable, on waking, said he had felt nothing at all. Long charged him $2, $2.25 actually, of which 25 cents was for the ether. He did the operation again and again over the following years on a number of local patients. But he was a country doctor. He was young. He did not, at first, publish. By the time he did, in a paper in the Southern Medical and Surgical Journal in December of 1849, Boston had already claimed the discovery for itself, and the world had already more or less decided that the discovery belonged to William Morton. There followed, for years afterward, an anxious and slightly sad priority dispute, with letters back and forth and legal petitions, and eventually, in Long's case, a quiet decision to stop fighting and simply go on practicing medicine, which he did in Georgia until the day he died in 1878. Both men have their monuments now. Long has a statue in the Capitol in Washington. Morton has a plaque on the Ether Dome. History is like this, more often than not. Two lamps lit in different rooms on nearly the same evening, and the room whose door is open to the street is often the one the passers-by remember. The other lamp still burned, of course, It just did not for a while catch the eye. Not long after ether crossed the Atlantic, a Scottish obstetrician named James Young Simpson, a large, cheerful man who was already at 36, the most famous professor of midwifery in Britain, began experimenting at his own dining table in a house on Queen Street in Edinburgh with a heavier, sweeter vapor called chloroform. Chloroform was a relatively new compound. It had been independently discovered 3 separate times in 1831 by chemists in France, Germany, and the United States. It was faster than ether, and it did not sting the airways in the same way, and it smelled, some said, a little like ripe fruit, and others said, less charitably, a little like an old sock. Simpson, having read about it, and having heard from a colleague that a small quantity, inhaled, produced a swift and pleasant sleep, decided to try it on himself. He and 2 friends, a Dr. Duncan and a Dr. Keith, one November evening in 1847, poured some of it into tumblers at the end of dinner, inhaled cheerfully, chatted for a moment about how odd they felt, and then woke up an hour later, delighted and rather scandalized, to find themselves lying on the floor beneath the dining table. They tried it again. They tried it on Mrs. Simpson's niece. They tried it on the housekeeper. It worked. Simpson began that same winter to use chloroform in childbirth, and the practice spread quickly, though not without argument. Some clergymen, particularly in the Scottish Free Church, objected. Pain in labor, they said, had been ordained by God, and to spare a woman that pain was to interfere in matters that were not properly the physician's business. Simpson, who was a devout man himself, was not troubled by this. He answered them with a certain dry Scottish patience in a widely circulated pamphlet that the Lord had put Adam into a deep sleep before removing his rib, and that this, so far as he could tell, was the earliest recorded use of anesthesia in the West, performed no less by the highest possible authority. The argument, when he put it that way, did not have much of a place to go. Simpson also, being a canny man, kept a bottle of chloroform in his coat pocket for the rest of his life, and would sometimes at parties offer a whiff to any guest who was curious. He was buried, when the time came, in Warriston Cemetery in Edinburgh, with an epitaph that said simply that he had greatly relieved human suffering, which is, when you think about it, one of the highest things you can say about a person. The argument in the pulpits was quietly ended, once and for all, on April 7th, 1853, when Queen Victoria, of all women the least likely to seek the novel, accepted chloroform from her personal physician, Dr. John Snow, for the birth of her 8th child, Prince Leopold. This is the same Dr. Snow who, a year later, would draw the famous map of cholera cases around the Broad Street pump in Soho and single-handedly begin the science of epidemiology. He was a careful, small-boned, teetotal man, deeply methodical, and the Queen trusted him entirely. He administered the chloroform on that spring afternoon, drop by drop, on a folded handkerchief, in small, careful doses of about 15 minims each, perhaps a milliliter, held gently over her face during each contraction and lifted away between them. The birth lasted 53 minutes. She did not lose consciousness completely. She remained aware of what was happening, but the sharp edges of the pain were dulled, and she wrote in her diary afterward that the effect had been soothing, quieting, and delightful beyond measure. What the Queen accepts, the Empire accepts. And chloroform for a good long while was the anesthesia of the drawing room and the delivery room and the wounded soldier at the field hospital. It was called tenderly, in the language of the courts, chloroform à la reine, chloroform in the manner of the Queen. 4 years later, when Prince Beatrice was born, Snow was again in attendance, and again Victoria wrote of the blessing. It was, in a certain sense, the moment at which the argument was finished, when the highest woman in Christendom accepts a mercy. The mercy is accepted. Language remembers what it approves of, and a very great many mothers in the century that followed were spared a very great deal because a queen in a chamber allowed a physician with a small folded handkerchief to sit beside her and be careful. Nitrous oxide, meanwhile, had its own longer and slightly comic history. The young English chemist Humphry Davy, later Sir Humphry, later the discoverer of sodium and potassium and the miner's safety lamp, inhaled it in the year 1799 at the Pneumatic Institution in Bristol at the age of 20. He felt his cares dissolve. He laughed. He wrote at length about the experience in a book with the wonderful title Researches Chemical and Philosophical, chiefly concerning nitrous oxide, in which he called the gas first delightful, and then, in a footnote of astonishing prescience, suggested that its properties may probably be used with advantage during surgical operations. That was 1800. No one paid the footnote much attention. It became, instead, over the next several decades, a fairground entertainment. Traveling showmen would set up on village greens and invite volunteers up on stage to breathe from a rubber bladder of the gas, and audiences would howl with delight as the volunteers giggled and stumbled and folded themselves gently into the wings. One of these showmen in New England was a man named Gardner Quincy Colton, who had once been a medical student and now made his living touring the eastern United States with a nitrous exhibition. It was at one of Colton's shows in Hartford, Connecticut, on the evening of December 10th, 1844, that a local dentist named Horace Wells was in the audience. Wells watched a young man breathe the gas, stagger about the stage, and then cut his leg badly on a bench. And this was the thing that struck Wells. The young man laughed through the injury, and only later, when he sat down and touched his trousers, noticed the blood. Wells went home that night and could not sleep. The following morning, he asked Colton to bring the gas to his office, and had one of his own molars pulled while under it by his colleague John Riggs. He felt nothing. He tried it in his practice. It worked. The next year, at the very Massachusetts General Hospital, where Morton would later triumph, Wells attempted a public demonstration, but the patient stirred and cried out. The dose had been too light, and Wells was hissed out of the room. He never entirely recovered from the humiliation. His later story is a sad one, and we will not dwell on it here beyond saying that he suffered greatly and that the nitrous he loved eventually harmed him. But in the same decade, from that first breath of ether by Long in Georgia to the fainting on Simpson's dining room floor in Edinburgh to Wells's tooth in Hartford, the old wish, the wish that runs from the poppy in summer through the monk's sponge to the granite hospital in Boston, was, in the space of a single decade, answered 3 separate times in 3 separate countries by 3 unassuming men. And the world, having asked for this for 6,000 years, received it in the end in a rush. Modern general anesthesia in the surgical suites of this century is no longer one drug at all. It is a small considered orchestra of them, played in careful overlapping succession. There is, first, a drug to make you unconscious. The induction agent, usually propofol, sometimes etomidate for a patient whose heart is fragile. There is a drug, second, to keep you unconscious. The maintenance agent, most often one of the volatile vapors delivered by ventilator, which we will come to in a little while. There is a drug, third, usually an opioid, fentanyl, or one of its short-acting cousins like remifentanil, to blunt the deeper wince of the body even when the mind is gone, because the body without opioid will still respond to the surgeon's incision with a rising heart rate and a rising blood pressure, even though the person inside is nowhere to feel it. There is often, fourth, a muscle relaxant, rocuronium or vecuronium, or sometimes the old workhorse succinylcholine, so that the body will lie perfectly still, will not tremble in the surgeon's field, and will not shift, even slightly, as an instrument is guided into a delicate place. There is, fifth, an anti-nausea drug, ondansetron most commonly, though sometimes a small dose of dexamethasone as well. Because nausea after surgery is, for many patients, the worst part of the whole experience, and it can be very largely prevented if you plan ahead. And there is a sixth and a seventh and sometimes an eighth. Saline for the veins, an antibiotic if the case calls for it, a small dose of an alpha agonist if the blood pressure needs support, a tiny amount of glycopyrrolate to keep the mouth from becoming too wet, each doing its small, kind job. The anesthesiologist, at the head of the table, literally at the head, because that is where the airway is and the airway is her domain, conducts. She watches a screen full of numbers, the oxygen saturation hovering, one hopes, at 99 or 100, the end-tidal carbon dioxide rising and falling gently with each ventilator breath, its little sawtooth wave, the heart's slow beating, translated into a green line marching across the screen, the blood pressure taken every 5 minutes or so by a cuff on the arm, its number appearing in a corner, the temperature, the nerve stimulator which tells her how deep the muscle relaxation is. She adjusts slightly. She turns a dial 0.5% one way, 0.5% the other. She checks the drip. She calls out a number to the circulating nurse. It looks, from any distance at all, almost as though nothing is happening. That, in a strange and beautiful way, is the whole point. The ritual, if you have ever undergone it, is nearly always the same, and it has a certain quiet dignity to it that people later often remember with a kind of gratitude. You will have been asked the night before not to eat or drink after midnight. You will have arrived at the hospital in comfortable clothes. You will have been given a gown and a pair of thin blue socks with rubber grip on the soles. You will have been asked your name and your date of birth and the name of the surgery you are about to have and the side of the body it will be done on, asked and asked again, and sometimes asked a third time by a different person, because the double-checking is not distrust, but tenderness, and because everyone in that room takes seriously the small chance of a wrong operation, which is the thing they are working together to make impossible. You will have had an IV placed in the back of your hand, a small cold spot, a brief sting, and then the reassuring feel of tape and gauze. Somebody, quite often, will mention a warm blanket, and one will appear freshly out of the warming cabinet and be tucked around your shoulders. Someone in blue scrubs will lay a hand on your shoulder. The anesthesiologist herself, or perhaps her resident, or the nurse, and will ask you a small ordinary question. What kind of work do you do? Where do you live? What is that book you brought? And then, in the middle of your answer, or just after it, she will ask you to count backward from 10. It is a curious choice of task, that an instruction gentle enough that you can perform it without trying, and simple enough that the moment you falter, everyone in the room will know exactly where you went. They will say your name. They will tell you that you are safe. They will tell you they will take good care of you. 10, you will say. 9, 8. And if we are being honest, that is usually as far as anyone gets. Somewhere around 8 or 7. The count softens, the room widens, the corners lose their edges, and then there is simply nothing to report. You have crossed a threshold that no one, not once in the history of the practice, has ever remembered crossing. There is no memory laid down for the crossing itself. There is only the arrival on the other side. And even that, when it comes, will come in loose layers, in a place later that will smell of warm cotton and mild disinfectant, with a voice very close, gently saying your name. The drug that carries you across in the first moment is almost always a milky white liquid called propofol. It comes in a small glass vial, and it looks, in the light of the operating room, a little like cream, like the top of the milk in an old-fashioned dairy bottle. Michael Jackson, in one of the strangest side stories in modern pharmacology, called it milk, and asked for it, tragically, as a sleep aid. Propofol was developed in the late 1970s in the research laboratories of Imperial Chemical Industries in England by a chemist named John Baird Glenn, a modest and careful Scotsman who worked on it for years before it reached the clinic in 1986. Because it does not dissolve well in water, it is delivered as an emulsion, tiny droplets of propofol suspended in a mixture of soybean oil, egg lecithin, and glycerol, which is what gives it the milky look, and which is also why patients who are allergic to eggs are asked gently before it is used. It works within about 40 seconds. You feel, patients say, a coolness climbing the arm, then a heaviness in the eyelids, then nothing at all. Propofol acts, mostly, at a receptor called GABA-A, one of the great quiet gates in the brain. GABA, gamma-aminobutyric acid, if you want its full and slightly unwieldy name, is the calming letter of the neural alphabet. It is the message that tells a neuron to hush. It is what your brain uses, constantly, to keep itself from firing too much, from getting overexcited, from going off the rails. About a third of all the synapses in your cortex use it. And when propofol binds to the GABA-A receptor, the gate opens a little wider than usual, and a stream of small ions, chloride mostly, flows into the neuron, and the neuron's electrical charge becomes more negative, more difficult to trigger, and it falls silent. Not dead, not damaged, just quiet. The metaphor I like best is one from a certain gentle textbook. That propofol does not sing your neurons to sleep. It simply lowers their microphone. They are still there. They are still capable of firing. They are just, for a while, no longer allowed to be loud. It is a very tender kind of quieting, if you think about it. The very same molecule, GABA, that gets slightly amplified every time you take a deep breath before bed or drink a cup of chamomile tea or feel a familiar hand come to rest between your shoulder blades, is the molecule that anesthesia more forcefully, more completely whispers to. Propofol is not a stranger to your brain. Propofol is just a very loud invitation to something your brain already knows how to do. Once you are under, and we still use words like asleep and under, though neither of them is quite right, the anesthesiologist will most often switch to a vapor. Sevoflurane, most commonly, in adult surgery today. Isoflurane still in some places, particularly in older machines. Desflurane occasionally, for its very rapid onset and offset, though it has a sharper smell that requires a particular kind of vaporizer. And there is a long, quiet history behind these compounds. The volatile anesthetics all descend in their family tree from chloroform and then from ether, and then, in the 20th century, from a compound called halothane, which was synthesized in 1951 at Imperial Chemical Industries, the same company later that would give the world propofol, and which was, for decades, the dominant inhaled anesthetic in the world. Halothane had a mild, pleasant smell, was easy on the airways, and worked beautifully. But in rare cases, it caused a serious injury to the liver, and by the 1980s, the newer, safer fluorinated ethers had begun to replace it. Sevoflurane, which reached the clinic in 1990, is a small, sweet-smelling molecule, a modified ether with a good many fluorine atoms, delivered on the breath, in and out, with each exhale of the ventilator. It works everywhere at once, at many receptors, in many small ways. Nobody, honestly, quite knows all of its molecular targets. It acts on GABA-A, as propofol does, but also on glycine receptors in the spinal cord, on certain potassium channels, on the machinery of synaptic release. The anesthesiologist watches the numbers on her screen, a number called the end-tidal sevoflurane concentration, which tells her how much of the gas is in the alveoli of your lungs, and therefore more or less in the fluid around your brain. And she turns a dial 0.5% one way or 0.5% the other. If the patient stirs, if the heart rate creeps up, if a small tear appears at the corner of an eye, she deepens the vapor. If the blood pressure droops, if the color of the fingers pales, she lightens it. It is, honestly, a kind of playing, the sort of playing a very careful person does with a very valuable instrument over hours, without ever taking her attention away from the sound of it. And when the surgery is over, and the last stitch is placed, and the drapes are folded back, she will turn the vapor off, and the vapor will begin to leave your body, breath by breath, and the process of returning will, in its own quiet order, begin. But what exactly is happening in your brain during all of this? For a very long time, this was almost as mysterious as consciousness itself. We knew the drugs worked. We knew in a rough way which receptors they touched, but we did not know at the level of large-scale networks what it was that we were doing when we turned a person off. In the last 20 years or so, though, a picture has begun to sharpen, and it is a strange and beautiful picture, and it does not look at all like what you might have expected. It seems that anesthesia does not simply shut off individual neurons. It does not, that is, cause the brain to go silent. On a good EEG, a good dense EEG of the kind used in modern research, you can see plenty of activity even in a deeply anesthetized brain. Many neurons go on firing. The thalamus is a kind of switchboard, or, if you prefer, a kind of very ancient telephone exchange, in which almost every signal from the senses and most of the loops of thought are routed and rerouted and passed along moment by moment in an unceasing hum. When anesthesia takes hold, that switchboard goes quiet. Not entirely, but the traffic falls. It is a bit like a great city at night, when a widespread blackout takes down the phone system. The houses are still there, the people inside are still moving around, the individual street lamps that run on independent circuits are still burning, but the network, the calling and answering that made the city feel like a single place, has stopped. There is a beautiful phrase for this in the scientific literature, coined by an Italian-American neuroscientist named Giulio Tononi, who has spent his career trying to formalize in mathematical terms what consciousness is. He calls it the loss of integrated information. The theory itself, Integrated Information Theory, or IIT, if you like the acronym, is complicated and, in some places, controversial. But its central intuition is disarmingly simple, and it applies rather beautifully to what anesthesia does. When you are awake, your brain is doing something extraordinary. It is loose thread, and when a good EEG watches this happen, it sees the fast, complex, weaving patterns of waking give way to slow, simple, spreading waves, the great, unhurried waves of the deep unconscious, rolling in like the sea on a very quiet night. This is one of the few times in modern science when the poetry and the physics almost coincide. You close your eyes in one room and open them in another, and the interval, the hour, the 4 hours, the 6, is not shortened or lengthened or remembered wrong. It is simply not there, as if that piece of your life had been carefully, considerately cut out and set aside, and then the two ends stitched together so neatly that you cannot find the seam. Some patients report a faint sense of having been elsewhere, but even that is very rare, and it usually turns out on gentle questioning to be a dream from the moments of emergence, the last brief flicker before consciousness fully returns, and not from the deep anesthesia itself. There are people, occasionally, who report unwanted awareness during surgery, a rare and terrible event that anesthesiologists work extremely hard to prevent, using specialized monitors and careful drug dosing. But this is not the ordinary experience. The ordinary experience is the seam you cannot find. And that is, in the end, one of the most philosophically interesting things about the human mind, that a significant piece of your life can quite deliberately be removed from it, and no one, not you, not the surgeon, not the memory itself, will miss it in any way that hurts. Most patients, in the first hours of recovery, feel a mild sleepiness and perhaps a small dryness in the mouth from the anticholinergic drugs, and perhaps a mild ache from the surgery itself. But the return of consciousness, when it happens, feels natural. It feels, in fact, so natural that people afterward often struggle to believe that anything unusual has happened at all, that the thing which cannot be described and cannot yet be explained was, for some hours, gone. If you are the kind of person who has lain awake once or twice in your life, worrying about anesthesia, worrying about not waking up, or waking too soon, or losing yourself somehow in the interval, you may notice right now your shoulders settling a little. That is a good sign. Let them settle further. Let the small breath that is available to you be the whole of what you need to do. The people who watch over patients in these rooms are among the most meticulous humans our civilization has produced. Anesthesiology, as a specialty, is one of the longest and most demanding in medicine. It requires 4 years of medical school, and then a preliminary year of general medicine, and then 3 years of anesthesiology residency, and then for many, a further fellowship of 1 or 2 years in a subspecialty: cardiac, pediatric, obstetric, neuro. By the time a person is standing at the head of your table, they have watched thousands of induction and emergent sequences and have practiced in low-fidelity and high-fidelity simulators dozens of the rare emergencies. Their eyes do not leave the numbers. Their hands are always within reach of the small adjustments, the monitors that watch you, the pulse oximeter on your finger, the capnograph in the breathing circuit, the blood pressure cuff on your arm, the electrocardiogram on your chest, the temperature probe, the nerve stimulator, in some cases a processed EEG monitor as well, were made mandatory in the 1980s when the American Society of Anesthesiologists issued a set of standards for basic anesthetic monitoring that has, in the decades since, been quietly adopted by essentially every hospital in the developed world. Nothing happens quickly. Nothing is left to chance. There is a pause at the start of the case called the surgical timeout, in which the entire team stops and confirms out loud the patient's name, the operation, the side, the antibiotics that have been given, the allergies. The pause is mandatory. It is not skipped. And the drugs themselves have grown so gentle, so precise, so short in their action, that a modern general anesthetic for a healthy adult undergoing an elective surgery is safer statistically than the drive to the hospital, which is not, when you think about it, a small thing to say. And yet the mystery, the real mystery, remains. We can tell you now in some detail which molecules touch which receptors. We can tell you which brain networks fall silent and in what order and at what depth of anesthesia. We can even tell you on that quiet EEG what the loss of integrated information looks like on paper. The slow rolling waves, the loss of complexity, the collapse of the fine, intricate patterns of waking into the great, sea-like rhythm of the deep unconscious. But the harder question, what it is that the thalamus and the cortex together were producing that vanishes when they stop talking, that question is exactly as open as it was in 1846 on the morning of the ether dome. We have not answered it. We have not, in some sense, even quite framed it. Consciousness can be switched off. Consciousness can be switched on. We do not, at the deepest level, know what it is that we are switching. And there is something quietly consoling in that, I think. It means that whatever you are right now, listening to this, the small, warm presence behind your eyes, the thing that is, in this moment, aware of the sound of my voice and of the softness of the pillow and of the small tick of some clock somewhere, is a phenomenon that has not been explained away. It has been described and worked with and gently managed, but not explained. You are, in a very real sense, still a wonder. The centuries have not made you smaller. The neuroscientists, for all their beautiful graphs and their precise pharmacology, have not managed to reduce you to a machine, though they have, along the way, described a great many of the machineries you are running on. There remains, at the very center of what you are, an unexplained brightness, which the anesthesiologist can turn down and turn back up, and which she cannot, and no one yet can, quite say what it is made of. Every religion has had a name for it. Every philosophy has had a theory of it. And every night, when you drift toward the ordinary sleep that is waiting for you, you rehearse, in a mild and reversible way, the great trick that ether and chloroform and propofol and sevoflurane all imitate. You put yourself down, you wake up again, and no one, not the philosophers, not the neuroscientists, not the anesthesiologists in their quiet rooms in the dead hours of the morning, can yet tell you exactly what it is that has just happened. And so tonight, as you begin your own softer, more familiar version of the trick, as you begin to fall away into the ordinary sleep that awaits you, gentler and slower than any operating room could arrange, and requiring no monitors, and no attending physician, and no small folded handkerchief with 15 minims on it. Let the day close. Let the lamp beside the bed do the small work of dimming without you doing anything at all. Let the clock on the nightstand keep its own time, and let you be quietly excused from keeping any time of your own. Let the pillow beneath your head be the whole architecture of the room. There is a very old lineage, from the poppy in the Sumerian tomb, to the sleeping sponge in the medieval infirmary, to the ether dome in Boston on that Friday morning in October, to the Queen in her chamber in Windsor, to the country doctor in Georgia with his soaked towel, to the Scottish obstetrician waking beneath his dining table, to the anesthesiologist watching over someone's grandmother right at this very moment, in some quiet room, in some quiet hospital, adjusting a dial by 0.5%, of people who have made this softening their careful, tender labor. And that labor is the same labor in the end that your own body performs every night without your having to ask it. The neurons dim, the switchboard hushes, the tapestry loosens, the thread rests, and you, the small, warm presence behind your own eyes, are excused for a while from the difficult work of being someone. You are, in your own way, joining that long lineage now. You are, in your own way, letting yourself go under, without any of the strangers, without any of the machines, without any of the fear. And in the morning, you will be handed back to yourself, whole, rested, yours, the same you who lay down, unaltered by the interval, unhurt by the loss of the hours, slightly more of a mystery, perhaps, than you were before you knew all this, but no less loved for it, and no less loved by yourself. Sleep gently. Nothing, tonight, is required of you. The lamp will dim on its own. The story will hold itself where it is, and will be here again in whatever form you next need it. There is no test in the morning, and there is no measurement being made, and there is nothing that you must do or think or remember. Only the small, quiet miracle, which your body already knows by heart. Good night.